Hello and welcome to Survivor Space and today's Survivor Circle session on the male code, the collision between masculinity and trauma. We are very glad you've joined us today. My name is Becky Perkins. I'm the Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project, and I'm very happy to welcome back Rick Goodwin as our presenter today. Just a couple of notes about today's session. You're watching this on the Survivor Space Survivor Circle page, but it's being live streamed through YouTube. So if you would like to see the screen larger, you can click on the small little square in the bottom right corner of the screen to enlarge it. If you need to step away for any reason during the presentation today, it will be recorded, so you can go back and watch the entire session on YouTube later. If you're on the Survivor Circle page right now, you should see a chat box, and you are able to type in a question or a comment at any time in that box. Rick is going to spend about the first half of the session today going over the presentation that he's prepared. And then once that is over, we'll have kind of an open time for folks to propose questions or offer any insights that you have, but feel free to type in any questions or comments as we go along. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rick, and we are glad you're all here. Welcome, Rick.
Thanks, Becky. And yes, welcome to all. I welcome any male-identified survivor who's coming in today, as I would like to think this workshop will speak to some of your experiences. And welcome all those who care for, who love, who provide service to male-identified survivors. And we can't do this work in isolation. And I know from my experience running this clinic up here in Canada that focuses on men in therapy, that I'd say close to half of our inquiries of service come from those loved ones of men, particularly male survivors. How can what services can you offer, say my husband, my son? And we'll explore some of the reasons why maybe we get interest of our services from a variety of folks. So just to say, welcome everyone. This notion of the male code, which is the kind of the instruction page of masculinity, is not a topic just for men. We believe that this notion of the male code influences everyone, because we're all products of this society, and we'll just see how those values of masculinity intersect with the experiences of childhood trauma. So that's the agenda today, and I'm going to suggest, why don't we get into it? So, and there was already a question about Men in Healing. Again, we're based in Ontario, Canada. Clinical services and training, but I also wear another hat, and that's with the organization 1 in 6 Inc., of which I play a role in providing online support group services for men, as well as their trainer on matters of engagement, intervention, and clinical aspects of providing therapy for male survivors. So 2 hats, 1 speaker. Let's get on with the work. I guess before we do that, let's give a big thanks to our funders, and that's the U.S. Department of Justice. They provide funding to the Zero Abuse Project on many initiatives, in particular this one today. So want to just acknowledge those folks for making the space available for all of us. These 6 words, I think, convey so much about the reality of men who have the lived experience of in particular sexual abuse in childhood and youthhood. And that we can carry that further by using the term sexual assault of men, of adults. That we're still in the process of, I think, redefining or revisioning what we mean by sexual violence. And we know that the silence around this topic got blown out of the water by the movement in the late 70s and 80s here in North America. We could call that the second wave of feminism, where there was that breaking of silence around issues of sexual assault, of domestic violence, which led to creation of services kind of like ZAP, like sexual assault centers and shelters for abused women. And while the initial focus back then was on the experiences of girls and women, here we are now. We're, I guess we're a good generation, maybe 2 generations later, now articulating the needs and capacity for those men who have similar experiences. And of course, as we go from that initial framing of this as an issue of women's experience to one that men have experienced too, I believe it opens the opportunity to now be able to speak to people of all genders whose lives may well be affected by issues of abuse and assault. But up until recently, the experiences of boys and men had a reference of it. It didn't happen. It was relatively invisible because of our predominant focus on girls and women. And even if it did happen, this notion, the social value of masculinity, that as guys, maybe it doesn't really impact us much. It doesn't matter. Men can kind of brush it off. They can suck it up. They can do all these. We have lots of these sayings around what we'll be getting into today, which is the male code, and how the male code plays havoc for those male-identified folks who have lived the experience of trauma. And again, hence, that's why we're here. Now, before we get into the male code specifics, we need to recognize that we're not really here talking about masculinity. We are talking about many masculinities and the necessity for service providers, for communities, for loved ones to recognize that there are many, many expressions of masculinity, and it would do no one service if we didn't acknowledge that. So here's just some of the identifiers we use in our clinical programming at our clinic so that all the guys who come into our services have a working vocabulary around issues like gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and then lastly, sexual expression. And not surprisingly, if we're talking about male survivors, those men who have lived experience of sexual abuse, this is essential knowledge to capture the true and unique and complex lives that everyone has, particularly so of men that may be in minorities in terms of sexual identity and sexual expression. So I wanted to frame that. We're not going to be getting into this in detail today, but just to say we recognize that very much. So the male code was probably one of the first, what we would call a granddaddy theory around a critical analysis of masculinity. And this came up in surprisingly, back in the 1970s. And yet the strength of this analysis has carried on. Now we know things are changing in society around gender codes. They're changing slowly. And that's good to see. So we can reflect back on David and Brandon's work to think about, has there been shifts and in which way? And yet all the new writers around masculinity theory, what we call the new psychology of masculinity, make reference to David and Brannon's pioneering research around masculinity. Now, we could have said before they were on the scene, well, hasn't psychology been a male-dominated science? I mean, if we think about who all the psychologist leaders were, Freud, Piaget, Maslow, Kohlberg, on and on, they're all writings from men, from white men in particular. And we could say, well, why do we need to talk about this new framework of understanding masculinity? And I guess the only response before we get into this is to say that the Freuds and Piagets and the Maslows and all those folks had things to say, but they never, I'll say this from my belief, they never really captured the inner experience of being a man. So now this is required, I think, for us to understand and how to support men who've experienced sexual trauma in their lives. We have to explore and support aspects and their expressions of masculinity. I mean, how could we not? So with that introduction, let's look at the male code. According to David and Brannon, there are 4 separate yet intertwining components of masculine identity and expression. I'm going to take liberty in splitting that 4th category into 5 or into 2. So we'll be looking at 5 codes of masculinity in reflection of their work. So let's look at the first one. The first one, the rugged individual, suggests that even though we're social beings, as we are human beings, and human beings are essentially social. We're wired for connection. We are pack animals. We are tribal people. And probably for close to 99% of the time we've spent on this planet, we have eked out our existence in small tribes of people, maybe 30 to 50. Most of that time was on the plains of Africa, and each day trying to figure out what we could do, what we could eat so we can survive and not be eaten. And so many gender theorists reflect back over the eons in terms of how our gender codes may have first formulated. Here's the first one, that guys, being male identified, have to tough it out, being that rugged individual and not be dependent or reliant on others. This is one of the codings of that kind of suck it up, buttercup kind of stance in this world. And yet, the analysis here, the reflection is that even though as men we embrace aspects of the rugged individual, that's not really, we're kind of kidding ourselves a bit, because as men, that category of people, we're not necessarily any more rugged than any other gender. It seems more of a pretense, more of a display than a truism. If we really believe that men were rugged in their gender identity, then why would we be finding statistics that would suggest that men drink and drug much more so than women? What is that speaking to? Believing that rugged people wouldn't need to rely upon substances. Why would men be dying of suicide at least 3 times the rate of women? Why would that be the case? And we can go through a variety of measures. We can look at healthcare, we can look at our justice system, and we can recognize that men are not faring very well. And it challenges this notion of being rugged. So that's the first thing to be said. And these images on screen, just to get your thoughts going in terms of how men express or portray themselves. And, there's a couple of pictures up here of relatively famous people. But I want to point out that what Nelson Mandela suggests to me is that there may be a part of you that says, well, if these guys could just stop following these values, these codes, the world would be a better place. Like if they could just kind of clear them off the table. And yet, if that was even possible, I'm not even too sure, but it would be, we truly would be losing heroes. We truly would be losing leadership. And I think of Mr. Mandela and all the sacrifices he made, including spending 27 years in jail for his values. Not just his values, but the values of the people he served. And his quest for social justice meant enormous sacrifice by him. He experienced enormous pain because of that. And yet, he also exemplified the rugged individual. So it's not necessarily a simple job to say, okay, stop doing that and you'll live a better life. I think we would all have to deeply consider what this may mean. Let's move on to the second code from those folks. And here, the reference is called the big man. Now, whoever the big man is can change from day to day or year to year. But we're talking about a relatively competitive structure between men of ranking of social acknowledgement, social standing, and the many, many benefits that one receives, the higher up they go in terms of this relative, like better words, competition. If you were visiting me in my hometown of Ottawa, we could walk down the street and maybe we would find representation of the big man by the fellow who's sitting in the back of a stretched limousine, not sitting in the front of the limousine, at the back. We would say, oh, okay, that guy's got some money and power, what have you, he's a big man. But this notion of the big man and this relative competitive standing and hierarchy, we can look in any context. We could overhear a conversation between men at a bar, and the questions might go like, "Okay, well, good to meet you. Oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, yeah, you do that. Okay." And we kind of assess and figure out where other people stand. Oh, okay. What kind of car do you drive? Was that a Hummer? No, Hyundai. Oh, a Hyundai. Okay. And we would again be doing this kind of assessing, and we may be asking, oh, who are you sleeping with? And again, relative standing, knowing that the higher up on the hierarchy, the more prominence one has, and possibly the greater likelihood of choice of sexual partners, because we know social standing does give men that. And we can also we have a notorious detention center in town, and we could say, well, where's the big men in there? And I'd say it'd be pretty easy to figure out. We could go to the recreation hall at the detention center and see which man is holding the clicker for the TV. And from that clicker holder, we would have a sense of who the big man is there. And if you had any doubt, you could try taking the clicker away and seeing the consequence of that action. So this is real. This is palpable in men's lives. It's true in many, many cultures around the world. And we need to understand men's experiences, not just high on the hierarchy, but also the reality of men who are relatively lower standing on the hierarchy. We've provided services for many years at a homeless shelter in my town here. Well, many of those men don't even have a key in their pocket, a key that reflects privacy, a safety, some of their own space. So they know what it's like not to be a big man just as well. Here, the third one is probably the one aspect of the male code that we're most familiar with as a society, and that is men's relationship with aggression and violence. And as you can see, we could have definitions, we could have debates about socially sanctioned violence. And we can also say, well, there's socially unsanctioned violence, and there's lots of room in between that we really don't know what the heck we're doing in terms of this relationship to aggression and violence. But we do know that this is pretty stubborn male domain. If we looked at people, say, in jail who are convicted of crimes of violence, we'd be looking at around 90% of that audience or that population being male identified. We know our armed forces, despite universal hiring practices now, are still over 80% male identified folk working there. We know this is still quite alive and well, this particular code in society. So we need to reflect on this one as well. And now we're going to get to that one I'm kind of splitting in half. And it was originally conceptualized as no sissy stuff, but I'll start off by saying the rejection of any perception of femininity is another domain or code or deep value that men hold. And it might be, and again, images just to kind of stir your thoughts. Share a story that might get at this the clearest. Is that I know of a young man. He's 20, 21. Known him since he was in preschool because he's the same age as my youngest daughter, and became friends with this boy's family that we met many years ago. So I've seen this boy grow up. Now, when he was 5, 6, up to 7, he was a boy who just loved to perform. He would take courses at the community center on dance. He loved to, mug to the camera. And one night I was over at his parents' place, and his dad and I were on the couch, and this fellow called John comes downstairs wearing his sister's tutu to put on a dance show for the parents in the room. And, it was a really lovely and cute moment to see this boy do his best at putting on this dance show. So, long story short, John doesn't dance. He hasn't danced for years, and his expression now is very conventional in terms of being a young man. And he hasn't performed, doesn't dance, and his attire is much like you would expect of a young man. So here now we have to consider what were the shifts going on for John in those years. And follow me then on this one, that at some stage of age, of awareness, John realized that this dancing thing he likes to do, the dressing up, the dance, the performance, that this is really what girls do, not what boys do. So he's got to stop doing that if he wants to achieve the value set of being a man. So he had to give up. He had to cut off part of his humanity, his unique human expression, in order to fit within those goalposts of manhood. And in doing so, he lost part of himself. Now, in losing part of oneself, there's a projection now on what in psychology land we call the other. And the other in John's case is girls. Well, this dance stuff, girls do that, not us guys do that. So the projection on the other, all those traits and attributes on the other. And then, and I haven't seen this of John personally, but it would be expected for many men who have gone down a similar path, that by now having this other identified, it allows then for that boy or that man, or for men in a whole, to put women down. To say, damn, a girl's thing, as a pejorative, as a put down, as a less than position. So gender theorists believe that what we commonly refer to as misogyny or women hating may stem from this very rigid notion of masculinity. And there's that psychological journey, disowning part of self, projecting it on the other, and then dismissal. And again, just images for you to consider. Now, that story about John, as useful as it may be, might be incorrect. So let's look at part 2 now of this notion of no sissy stuff. And part 2 would suggest that maybe John gave up dancing, not because it's what girls do, it's what gay guys do. Because we know that the norms of the male code, despite social progress on this issue, are still the normative codes of masculinity suggest it has to be heterosexual expression. And so what John may have gone through in his head would still be similar. He would have to reject these qualities within himself of, attire and using his body, performance, expression, all that kind of stuff. He gives those up. He has to give them up within himself in his quest for the male code. He projects that on the other, and the other now are gay men or gay people or whatever. And again, it could be then used as a dismissal of the other. Oh, that's what those gay guys do. And, we live in a society that we see many expressions of hatred towards GLBT plus folk, just like we see acts and expressions of hate against women. So we could now consider that the male code in its rigidity creates and maintains the expression of homophobia in society. So there we go. That's the male code, and very briefly presented, but I want to make a couple more observations before we open it up for discussion here. First of all, we all learn this, and all of us, regardless of our gender. So women learn this, men learn this, folks of all identities learn this. And we can ask ourselves, well, where the heck did we learn this? Now, some of us may say, well, but this is 2023 and it's not like it used to be. And this is true. However, I want you to think of men who may be presenting to a service for asking for help from a friend, and say our first question, well, how old are these guys? Now, even though that the average age of sexual abuse of boys is between 9 and 10, the average age of men showing up to our clinic for trauma recovery around childhood sexual abuse is 45. So we have to kind of remind ourselves that these men started learning these values 45 years ago, not yesterday. We could even consider that who was the most primary teacher of these codes probably were the parents of these male children. So we could be looking at value sets now no longer 45 years old, but maybe value sets that are even 70 years old. Why did those parents have those values and then share that with their children in the way they did? So things to keep in mind in terms of how embedded these codes are in all of us. And if we had to summarize what all these codes of masculinity are about, we could say in one word, if we had one word only, we would say that, well, masculinity therefore reflects invulnerability. Now, if that is true, if we could summarize all of the male code in some sort of presentation of invulnerability, then men are in an impossible situation. Male survivors are in an impossible situation. Is that if you're invulnerable, then you can't acknowledge your victimization, because invulnerable people it's impossible to victimize someone who's invulnerable. So this is an understanding for the immense silence that so many boys and men have compared to female-identified people in terms of why their hesitancy of asking for help, their reluctance to acknowledge these experiences, to the point that one author in this field that I quite respect refers to men who are survivors, that they have to experience what he calls a psychological death in order to reformulate themselves, reformulate their masculine identity that will allow them to acknowledge their wounds from childhood. Pretty strong stuff. And yet, this is work Richard Gardner, I think, has great merit for all of us in our support and understanding of men, men who are survivors. So I'd like to finish off, if I may, with words from John Breier, another trauma theorist that we follow. He starts off by saying, there's little doubt that men and women undergo many of the same traumatic events. So it's really maybe a percentage. How many boys are sexually abused? How many girls? What about physical abuse? What about neglect? All those kind of questions. They suffer in many of the same ways, but some traumas are more common in one sex than the other. Fair enough. And our sex role socialization then affects how the injuries are experienced at the moment of the abuse or the assault, and then how that post-traumatic expression shows. And those are the two areas that he believes have a significant impact on the content and process of trauma-focused therapy. So let's leave then Breier's last words there as reflection and open this up for discussion. So Becky, over to you. And Becky, first question, should I stop sharing my screen?
Oh, we can leave it on here for a couple minutes for folks, and then I can actually take it off the screen for you.
Okay. Very good.
And my apologies, it's my voice, my camera is having issues, so that's okay because people came to see you. But just wanted to let you know why I'm not on the screen. We have a comment. I've had two men in their 70s disclose and say they never had told anyone. Do you see any generational difference in response to the male code or any changes? I am thinking of Robert Bly, his book Iron John, and the men's movement of the 90s.
Wow, that's a good
a follow-up comment to that. He said shame, a tradition of hunting and lack of support for expressiveness created an atmosphere for male violence.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And why don't we spend a minute talking about shame? If we followed through on more critical reflection on masculinity, we could find a goodly amount of evidence to suggest that the masculine standards of behavior, the male codes, are impossible, truly, for any one man to achieve. Now, possibly in our lives, we're temporarily seen as a big man, or temporarily we conduct violence, we're the aggressor, and we have these moments. But as a whole, we refer to the power of the male code as the big impossible in men's lives. Well, if we're in a situation of not having the capacity to achieve expectations of us, then shame will result. And so this is a gender-based shame, because we're going to be in a chronic position of being less than, weaker than, poorer than, and all these attributes. Now, and I think that's one of the takeaways from that movement of masculinity back in the 80s, reflected by Robert Bly's work. Now, let's compound that, though, because we know shame is a master emotion for those who are survivors of childhood abuse. And if that's of interest to you, later on this fall, we should be doing a workshop on that, on the role of shame. The mastery motion, that it is a fuel, this notion of the I'm damaged, I'm a loser, I'm no good, all those harsh words that many survivors tell themselves. Then that compounds the original shame that men have, that I've previously mentioned. Shame is essentially a silencing of the human spirit. And we need to look then at how shame expresses itself in survivors' lives and ways that we can reverse that. And I think that's a good chunk of trauma recovery right there. So I know I'm going off on a bit of a tangent on the questions originally posed, but all important reflections, I think, on the subject.
Great. Thank you, Rick. I'm going to go ahead and take your PowerPoint slide off the screen, but if anyone needs to revisit that, we certainly can. A comment that came in: as a forensic interviewer, I found that I was interviewing an equal number of boys and girls, but boys had far less support and fewer healing resources and were less likely to speak out because they felt more responsible for the harm done to them. What have you found in your work with 1 and 6? What do you recommend as a way to help men, especially, release the sense that they ought to be able to take care of themselves, protect themselves, and that somehow it is, quote, their responsibility to avoid being hurt?
Yeah, that's a big one in many men's lives. Now, I need to say that my focus work is not around children or youth. My knowledge base truly is around adult men. But I do know enough about the sector to say that boys and girls do present themselves, again, this is more research I'm familiar with, in near equal numbers around issues like sexual abuse up until around adolescence. And then boys will disappear from the service networks. It seems like so many of the impact of so many of these codes kick in around that age. And it's just not on engaging in services. It's boys' friendships with other boys shift from being emotionally intimate and vulnerable to not being emotionally connected in that way. We know that boys' behavior towards girls will shift into ways that are more affirming of some of the judgmental aspects of that fourth code. Big changes occur in boys' lives, including removing themselves from a helping relationship. So, not surprisingly, young men bury this stuff. Average age of guys coming into, say, our anger management services is in the mid to late 20s. But on childhood abuse recovery, it's 45. So there's a lot more silencing. And I'm going to say there's a lot more inherent shame of being abused as a child than having a problem with one's anger, even though we know those are not disconnected issues. Many male survivors have issues around emotional regulation, anger, and rage. So we have to kind of work backwards. We can't work with people who don't, as a service provider, I work with people who walk through our doors. I can't work with guys on the street that don't want to even talk about this subject. And the efforts made by 1 and 6 and other male serving organizations, I mean, we're all keenly wanting to target younger men, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those younger men walk through the doors. So I think we've got a lot to learn about how we can outreach effectively with young men, how we can maneuver around their presentation of masculinity, particularly as young men, to make a connection with them. I don't think we found that yet. It'll be a great day when we do, but I think we need to keep working towards that.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Another question. What do you tell men who have anger and rage and fury about what has happened to them, and what helps discharge rage in a healthful way for men?
Well, if a good fellow presents himself for counseling, and he's got childhood trauma of some sort, it doesn't have to be sexual abuse, of course, and he has problems with his anger expression, issues of rage, possibly violence, then we would have to say to him, friend, you've got to do first things first. And the first thing then for that individual to address is his here and now display of anger and rage. And so if he was a client of our clinic, we'd be steering him towards our anger management services, saying that's the first step. Now, assuming he follows through on that, he may finish our programming around anger management, and he'll probably be more keenly aware that he's got a fire going on in his belly that leads him to these inappropriate displays of anger and rage and violence. And that original wound, if you want to change the metaphor, is from his childhood. We know this from research, that the large majority of men who are abusive or assaultive or in conflict with the law, what have you, experience significant childhood abuse, neglect, physical, sexual, other forms of trauma, extreme bullying, that type of thing. So it's like the layers of the onion, another, sorry for the metaphor, I got to keep peeling them away. And so under the anger and rage, we all find childhood trauma. So we do get men transferring their interest and their focus working with us to childhood trauma after they've worked on their anger and rage. And I think that's the direction, and that would be the messaging I would encourage that individual to consider.
Great. Thank you, Rick. We've got a couple more minutes if folks have other questions. And as we typically say with these sessions, we'll leave the chat open for a little while. So if anyone has follow-up questions, we will certainly do our best to answer those.
If there are men who have the lived experience of childhood abuse, adult sexual assault, just do a plug that 5 days a week, there is an online support group that people can tap into free of charge. You don't have to give your name. You're asked to provide a nickname. And for 90 minutes to meet with other men who have the lived experience and talk about all the aspects of abuse recovery. In the room, there's always a professional counselor. So it's a very safe and anonymous way to get support, feedback, and learn some stuff around trauma, just like we've been doing today. So yeah, that may be a resource for some of the people who've signed up today.
Great, thank you, Rick. And we had a comment. Thank you very much for all this good and helpful information. And I will second that.
Very good, thank you.
And I just had kind of a question with, 1 in 6, I know has the Bristlecone Project. Certainly with Survivor Space, we have some stories and resources from male survivors. Do you find in your work that it's helpful for men who have experienced trauma to be able to see stories of other men who are survivors?
Yeah, for sure, Becky. So one aspect of the 1in6.org website is the Bristlecone Project, which are basically images and stories of male survivors. And for men who may be starting out on their journey, it would be useful to look at the profiles. I think we're over, well over 100 men who have volunteered to be on the Bristlecone Project. I'm one of them. And I would suggest to them is look at all the faces and see which face they most quickly identify with. And then you can drill down and read a bit about their life. And for many of the posts, there will be some video, a bit of a video interview with those men. And it's probably a very lovely way to start making connection with other men's stories, and yet do so without needing to identify yourself. So that notion of disclosure and then putting words to it, to that experience, and then saying those words out loud or, in type, I see this as it's a bit of a spectrum, as guys move along. And some of those initial stages of identifying and feeling connected to other men could well be an online experience. So Bristlecone Project, I think, is just brilliant at helping men understand other men's lives of guys who've gone through very similar experiences.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. Well, I know we've come to the end of our time today. I just want to thank you, Rick, for your wonderful information. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Again, this session recording will be available on the Survivor Space page, as well as on Zero Abuse Project's YouTube channel. So feel free to revisit this if it's helpful to you, or share it with others. Our next Survivor Circle session will be next week on the 7th at noon. We have our very first survivor-led Survivor Circle. Melanie will be speaking about the medical impact of trauma and how she advocated for herself through that process. So we look forward to that and hope to see you then. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining us. Take care.
Bye, folks.